All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our February 10th, 2021 Naples Mac User Group meeting. And we welcome everybody that's with us from all over the United States, Canada, and probably Australia and England. Our meetings are each and every week through June the 30th at this exact time, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you must be a member of Naples MUG to join our meetings, and that's primarily a Zoom issue to make sure that we don't have any Zoom bombings and so forth. So we're pretty strict about who comes into our meetings. Class registration continues on and continues on very, very strongly. In 2 weeks, or a week from this Saturday, is the photo class, which the instructor is Dan Wazing from Dan's Tutorials. And that should be one great meeting. So if you have a phone, iPad, you certainly want to sign up for the photo class, or a Mac. He'll talk about all three devices. The meeting, the class this Saturday is Jim Corsica, and it will be on streaming and entertainment. And the world is dramatically changing out there, and Jim will try to make it understandably to all of us, which is the best way to go, and all of the options. Here's a list of our classes. Don't forget, we had to reschedule our Zoom class, which is now March the 20th. And Dan is also going to do that class. And that's a class we all need to take. Zoom is a very large part of our future, as it currently is. Because of our successful class season, we have decided to award to all of our members a bonus class. It'll be a regular class, 2.5 hours. Each attendee will get a free Take Control book written by the presenter of the meeting, who was the author of the book. It's for Naples MUG members only. The name of the class is Managing Your Files, and this is something we all have to deal with. And so I think Eckert has told me we're almost close to 100 that have alerted him to the fact they want to take the class. The instructor is Jeff Carlson. He was a presenter back in September of 2020 on Luminar, a photo program. Everybody really enjoyed the meeting, and we have invited him back to do this meeting, the actual author of the book. All you have to do is make sure, and probably most of you have done so, that are interested, but those that have not done so yet, just make sure you send Eckert an email, and in the subject area type bonus class. That's all you got to do. And every meeting, I want to make sure everybody understands that there's a lot that goes on before these meetings take place. Practice sessions, communication to members who have lost their link to get into the class, and the list goes on and on and on. And Eckert's the guy that's very, very involved in that whole process. And we pretty much, he's got it pretty much down to a science, and we very seldom, you very seldom visibly see any major issues at our meetings with Zoom. On next week, we have a friend, a great friend of the Naples Mac user group, Christian Boyce, and Christian is also has agreed to be one of our instructors in 2022. Christian is from Northern California, and he's going to do an iPhone widgets workshop, and he wants everybody to make sure they have their phone with them for the meeting, and you'll work alongside of Christian in setting up some of these widgets. And of course, today's meeting is by our own member and board member, Mike Kwasniak from Suffolk, England. And he's going to talk about simple steps to better color. Welcome, Michael, and thank you.
Thank you very much, George.
It's all yours. We must have 51 photographers here.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. So good afternoon from sunny Ipswich in Suffolk, where we are promised the coldest night of the year tonight, and where I think within a 5-mile radius of our town, people are currently enjoying 8-foot snowdrifts. So this is going to be, unless you're all asleep by the end of the first session, which I hope you won't be, this is going to be spread across 2 sessions because there's a lot of information here to share. But I want to talk about what you can do to get the very best colors possible from your monitors and indeed iPads in the first session. And then in the second session, we'll get on to talking about printers and possibly cameras. So the very first time that I did a talk on color management, this question was immediately thrown at me when I suggested that we might hold such a session. Why should I care about color management? And the simple answer to this question is, if you don't share your images with anybody, there's no need to worry about color management at all. And if your images look fantastic on your computer screen, then, and you're not going to share them with anybody else, then that's all that matters. However, the problem comes when you start sharing the images with others, because of course, if their monitors aren't set up and calibrated in exactly the same way as yours is, colors can look very different indeed. And before I start my presentation, I really need to just tell you a bit about me. I'm a theatre photographer, and I'm sure that like every other theatre photographer on the planet, we adopted digital very, very quickly. And I was shooting digital with a Canon D10 in 2000. Now, to put that into context, HP, Microsoft, and Apple only invented the sRGB color space, and I'll talk at length about what a color space is a bit later. But that was only created in '96, so it was incredibly new technology in the year 2000. Up until then, I'd been working in theaters, and like most other photographers, I'd been off most weekends trying not to get cross with brides and grooms at weddings. And during that long period, we were shooting medium format. We were popping all of our little rolls of film into a bag, and we were sending them off to a lab. And the lab took lots and lots of care to color correct our negatives. So whatever the weather conditions, whether it was a really gray, dull day, whether it was a bright, sunny day, they would do their best to create the best possible colors that they could. However, with the introduction of digital, they just stopped doing that. They expected the photographers to sort out their colors. And initially, and very frustratingly, we were all color correcting our images on our screens, sending the files to the lab, and the prints that came back were generally horrible. I would argue so horrible that certainly for me personally, it wasn't until I started running a completely color managed system, in other words, right the way through from the monitor to the printer. It wasn't until I actually installed my own printer that I started getting colors that made me happy. Let me just show you what I mean. I didn't take these. I lifted them recently from Facebook, and they were pasted onto the page of the Royal Photographic Society by somebody I don't know. But I'm going to make a few assumptions about these pictures. I'm assuming that this is probably a not very experienced photographer. And I'm assuming that this photographer is not working with any kind of color management, because these three shots are clearly too dark. And this is where it all gets really awkward, because if these three images looked really good on this photographer's monitor and only looked rubbish when he shared them with others via Facebook, and in this case, unfortunately, with the Royal Photographic Society, he looks a bit of a mug because they're not very good. And that's not to say that they didn't look great at home, but they certainly don't look good here. And color management is all about consistency and kind of getting as close as you can to creating prints that look exactly like the colors that you see on your monitor. So what does it do? Here's a lovely shot I lifted from Google of some paint cans. And at a bit of a push, we probably all have the vocabulary to describe these colors, more or less. We have a bright magenta, we have a pillar box red, we have a grass green, we have a very acidic yellow, and that sort of thing, which is fine. But how on earth can you separate all of those different shades of red? It's absolutely impossible, because in all likelihood, no two of these are the same. And long before we bounced along as digital photographers, this was a problem that faced everybody in the world that, for example, outsourced the manufacture of goods from a different country. You couldn't just phone China and say, we'd like 200,000 red mugs, because they'd say, what red? What shade of red? And how, verbally, how could you possibly describe? It's simply impossible. So what happened is this. As early as the 1930s, I think it was a group of French scientists, color scientists, but they created the concept of a color space. And we'll have a look at that shortly. Time rattles on, and suddenly digital photography becomes a thing. And in the 1990s, the International Color Consortium, which included Apple, started to create color spaces for photographers. Now, what on earth is a color space? Here's another example, incident. This was taken a few years ago, but this was a TV shot in our town, and you can see that they're all showing slightly different colors, when you would hope really that they would all be the same. I think things are much better today than they were perhaps even 5 years ago, when this was probably recorded. But nevertheless, there's a real issue going on here, because which one do you pick? You might pick the one that has what you think are the best colors, but that may not be very well calibrated, and there's absolutely no way of telling. So here, if you're interested, is the, I think it's Wikipedia description of what color management is. But let me try and explain how it works. Scientists created something called a color space, and there's a diagrammatical representation of one here. And this space maps all of the colors imaginable to the human eye inside it. And it does it mathematically, so that absolutely every single color has an X value for its green channel, a Y value for its red channel, and a Z value for its other one, blue channel. So let's just going to turn this around. So if I'm talking to 51 photographers at the moment, you probably all shoot RAW with your cameras. And as this thing rotates, you can see, just like in the RAW, oh, don't stop, it stopped. Oh, sorry, okay. You can see we've got black down at the bottom, where the red, yellow, and blue values are 0. And we've got white at the top, where the red, blue, and green values are 255. And in between that, we have all of the other values, the RGB values that make up absolutely any image. So what happens in a color managed setup is that with a device that I'll show you in just a moment, you attach it to your monitor screen, you expose a number of colors to the device. The device knows the values that those colors should be, and it makes alterations within the software to match those colors and pull them into line with each other as best as it can. So before we just demonstrate that, let's just talk about the digital darkroom. I guess this is probably more of a problem for you guys in Florida than it is for me, because here in Suffolk, it's pretty dull outside much of the time. But for consistency, you will always create the best results if you can try and work in the same kind of environment. So here, I always keep the lights dimmed. I do actually have colleagues that work in a blackout while they're color correcting, so that there's no influence from outside at all. I don't find that necessary, but I do, whatever the time of day or night, keep the lights dim. During the day, I close the blinds to shut out as much daylight as possible. My workspace has a neutral color surrounding me. We'll talk about wild colors in a minute, but if color latency is a real issue with human eyesight. And if you stare at a bright color long enough, if, for example, if you had pillar box red walls, the light reflected from the walls will always have some sort of influence while you're color correcting images on your monitor. So if you can surround yourself with neutral colors, so much the better. And the same applies with bright clothing. You know, if you're wearing an absolutely blazing red pillar box red sweater, light will reflect off that sweater onto the monitor. And again, you may find yourself modifying way beyond where you should be, because part of the color that you're seeing is being influenced by your clothes. Everyone recommends using a neutral desktop wallpaper. I have seen, I'll show you one in a moment, but I've seen people's desktops sometimes and they've got raging, vibrant colors and patterns on them. Apple even have some in the operating system. I hugely advise that you don't use them for the same reason. Color latency is a real issue, and the duller, sadly, the duller your desktop looks before you start color correcting, the easier you will slide into accurate color correction. And finally, if you're using an external monitor, if there's a hood available for it, buy one. They're very cheap, and they'll help separate the monitor from everything around it. So if you've got a desktop that looks like this, you're asking for trouble. So just get rid of it. Go for tones more like this, that won't affect your eyesight. And also don't surround it with lots of chaos, because the human eye can interpret the presence of colors, certain bright colors can change the way that you interpret some tones. And in this example, this X looks like a much lighter color than this one on the right. However, if I just remove this white tab at the bottom, you see they're actually absolutely identical. This is my favorite optical illusion of all time. I hate that I'm unable to see the truth of this image, but I simply can't. If anybody in the room can at the moment, I would love you to tell me, because the fact about this image is that this tone here with the A on it is absolutely identical to this tone here, which has the B on it. And because it looks so impossible, I'm just going to prove it. So please bear with me for a moment. Just stop the share for a second and go back to my desktop. I hope. Brilliant. So is everybody seeing Adobe Photoshop now?
No, we're seeing you, Mike.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go back and share your desktop.
I hope that's better.
Yes, we see it now.
Great. Thanks, Sheeta.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to pick up a brush in Photoshop. I'm going to take it down to here, the B square. I'm just going to sample this tone of gray. And now I'm just going to paint. So you can see I'm painting exactly the same tone of gray. And as I work my way up here, you will see it's exactly the same. Impossible to believe, but there you go. And a huge lesson, I think, to be learnt from this image. It would be so easy to make mistakes. If you're in a situation where, because of areas of shadow and stuff, you're color correcting perhaps to something that you've got sitting next to the monitor, but because one is because that's shaded and the area that you're painting isn't, you could end up with completely different colors. So I should be able to get back into my keynote presentation. Marvelous. Whoops. So this looks equally ridiculous, and I won't prove it because I'm sure you'll take my word for it after seeing the last example. So this what looks like bright orange square on this giant Rubik cube is actually exactly the same color as this square up on top, which appears to be brown. It defies belief, but it's absolutely true. So the more caution you take when you're about to color correct, the better. So do at least some of the things that I suggested, like dimming the lights, closing the blinds. Don't wear bright colored sweaters, and it will make a huge, huge difference. Right, let's move on. So there are two pieces of hardware involved in this process. One is relatively cheap and one is not. I made the mistake of buying the one that's not because I thought lots and lots and lots of people would come to me and use the service. So I'll talk about that in a moment. First of all, though, the colorimeter. It's a very tiny device, about maybe 3 inches square. Sheeta, you may be able to help here. I don't know the best place for you guys to go price-wise. I know that on Amazon, one of these would cost about $160. But I guess probably you may be able to find cheaper deals around. In the UK, we have a store in Birmingham called Colour Confidence that always offers better prices than Amazon. So hopefully you can do the same in Florida. So this tiny device just attaches to your monitor and calibrates the monitor. The photospectrometer is a much, much more sophisticated beast. And I didn't look up a price in America, but when I tell you that in the UK, it's about £1,600, it's not something that people are likely to go out and purchase. I wish I hadn't, but hand on heart, I went out and spent the money because I thought ultimately I could make money out of it. And I was proved horribly wrong. Now, the great thing about the spectrophotometer is that printers can be profiled remotely. And I'll explain how you do that. So in other words, almost without doubt, people in Florida will be offering a service to profile printers. And they will send you sheets of, they'll send you patterns, sorry, that you then print onto sheets of photographic paper. You then send those sheets of photographic paper to them, and they will analyze them using one of these very expensive beasts. Typically, that service in the UK costs about £15. So we're talking, what, $18 or something. So it's really cheap, really cheap. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a £50 printer or a £500 printer, it will always make a difference, and it will always improve your color output on your printer. For the time being, let's just talk about monitor calibration. So here's our colorimeter, and a colorimeter is specifically designed to measure transmitted light. In other words, it's designed for you to hang in front of a monitor for the analysis of color. For anybody interested, these are the suggested monitor settings that I've stuck to. I always use white point of D65, which is daylight. So that's the general color temperature. Gamma of 2.2. LCD luminosity of 120 candelas. Now this is really important because the brightness of the image on your screen can make a huge difference to what your outputted print looks like, obviously. So if your monitor is too bright, which is often the case with new monitors, when you open an image on it, you might think, oh God, that's too bright. I better dial it down a bit. And I think, going back to those images that I showed you at the start of this slideshow, I think that that's what has happened with those shots of the river with the boats on. When I first did this presentation, I popped my colorimeter onto a friend's iMac, and it was reading 300 candelas. So that's 3 times the brightness that's recommended as a typical working choice. These days, this may even be too bright. Some people like to go down even further to 100 candelas and 90 candelas, but that's something that you can only judge yourself by producing a few prints and thinking, yep, that matches. For me, 120 candelas seems to work perfectly well. So ICC, you don't need to know about this because this is done automatically, but version 4 is the most modern ICC setting, and contrast ratio for most monitors is automatic, so you're not given an option to set it when you use the device. So let's have a look at what all this means. So this is my MacBook Pro on my desktop, and here's a little movie showing you just how easy it is. So I've pushed in all of those readings that I just explained before starting. And having done that, the software just walks you through everything that you need to do. First of all, you open the colorimeter. Then you hang it on your monitor. And with the MacBook Pro, the next thing that you'll need to do is to set the closest brightness level that you can. So up here, we can see an orange line and a green section, and you just need to get the orange line as close as you can to the center by jiggling the brightness setting. And once you've done that, it will start rattling through about, I think it's about 150 different colors, can't quite read it, 158 or something like that. And in each case, what's happening is the colorimeter is reading the color that it's being presented with. It knows what red, blue, and green values that color should be, and it creates something called an LUT. People sometimes actually call it a LUT, which it's a horrid word. LUT simply stands for lookup table, and the colorimeter will, the software, sorry, will create a lookup table for every single color, and for each shade of red, it will say, you know, if you're presented with his shade of red, it needs to be slightly redder, so you need to add X value of red and perhaps take away Y value of blue or something. But it does that for every single one. It's a completely automated process, so you don't even need to think about it. And the joy of all of this is the entire process is automatic. You don't even have to do anything afterwards, because once the colorimeter has finished its job, the software does a bit of churning, and then it will pop that lookup table into the system software without the need to do anything else at all. So hopefully this is pushing towards the end. We'll just let it rattle away.
While it's rattling, Mike, is that color lookup table going to be system-wide or application-specific?
It's system-wide.
Great, thank you.
How often do you do this process?
I do it once a month. Color is really, really important to me. Color, particularly with my main theatre. Oh, sorry, let me just, I'll come back to that, George, if I may. So it's finished the process. It's now telling you that you can close down the colorimeter, put its lid back on for safety, keep it dust-free, click on the next button, and everything that happens now is automatic. So we just say, yeah, thank you very much, carry on. And it's created something called an ICC profile. That is installed into your system folder, and every single thing that happens now happens through that LUT, that lookup table. So we've got some pictures available on the screen now with before and after. And so you can actually see if it's made any difference. And I think with this magenta, you can see quite a major jump between before there, which is much more saturated, and the after, which is where it should be. So my little MacBook Pro was producing magenta that was far, far too bright and vibrant. So those are the settings again. George, when we finish this, is it? I have notes. Is it possible to upload them somewhere where people can obtain them if they're interested?
Yes.
Yes, can you just send me the PDF?
Yeah, of course, of course.
And then when I send out the video, I will also send out the notes.
Fantastic, thank you. So just to go through these again, because they're so important, whatever white point setting is being recommended, everyone recommends for photographers using daylight, and 6500K Kelvin is daylight. It's also called D65. Gamma these days, there is only one gamma setting, which is 2.2. Apple historically had a lower worked at a lower gamma, but these days it's exactly the same as PCs. As far as the brightness level is concerned, I would recommend trying 120 candelas. And really importantly, if you do this for the first time with a bright monitor, you may be absolutely horrified to see how dark it looks at first. But of course, the human eye will just sort it out for you, but it takes a few seconds. So don't think you've done something horrifically wrong if you go through that process and things look a bit weird. So we're at 5:05, and that covers everything that we need to know really about monitor calibration. It's an absolute doddle. If color is super important for you, there are one or two companies around like ISO specifically, which I think is probably the best worldwide. I think it's German, and that actually make monitors that have built-in colorimeters. So you can just set the thing to run its calibration once a month in the middle of the night. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, when everybody the house is sound asleep, the monitor will switch on automatically. It will warm up for 15 minutes. The colorimeter will pop out from the side of the bezel. It'll run its routine of colors. The LUT will be updated if it needs to be updated. And when you wake up in the morning, you're greeted with a little sign that just tells it that your monitor's been successfully recalibrated. For most of us, it's $160 colorimeter. A really important point about colorimeters, because you know, $160 is quite a lot of money, and the important thing certainly about X-Rite equipment is that the software is freely downloadable. So in other words, if you have neighbors or friends that are interested in properly calibrating their monitors, you could club together, find 3 friends, throw in $40 each, and let it do the rounds. As I said, I tried to do that with this beastie, which is called a spectrophotometer, and is a great deal more expensive, and it failed miserably. So before I start talking about color spaces in detail and printers, does anybody have any questions?
There was a question, could you use this on an iPad Pro?
Yes.
Okay.
So it works in a very different way. So again, the software is free. You download the software, you attach your colorimeter to the iPad, you run the tests, but then the resulting LUT sits in X-Rite's cloud. So wherever you go, you can always access it. And the way that it's not as fully functional yet as it is with an ordinary monitor or laptop. At the moment, what you do is you do your color correction, and then you apply that LUT, and you can see what difference it is. From the limited experience that I've had with it, I don't have an iPad Pro, but I have a 2-year-old, I think, iPad. There was a very small amount of difference actually between what I was seeing on my screen and what I would get if I printed it. I suppose the important question here is, do people print color images from an iPad?
I would say yes.
I didn't know the answer to that, but so yeah, the answer is yes, but it's a slightly different process, and you need internet access in order to use it. Okay.
Yeah. Mike, I do have one concern. There is a Zoom artifact right in the top center of your screen.
I thought I'd switch that off. I do beg your pardon.
It's gone now.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Right, let's move on. So let's talk about photographic paper before we start talking about the hardware. Just as there are a few things that you could do to improve colors on your monitor that don't require a huge amount of effort, there are things that you ideally need to do with your paper. And unfortunately, all of these things cost money. I guess the general rule is, if the print matters to you, buy expensive paper, because all of these things will apply if you, sorry, all of these things won't apply if you buy top-end paper. I've used Epson paper a lot. I've used Fuji professional paper a lot. For my not that I've exhibited much, but I held an exhibition a few years ago celebrating 30 years at one of the local theatres. And I printed everything on paper from a French company called Canson. And the colors were absolutely dazzling. But not only were they dazzling in 2014, they are still dazzling because the Canson paper doesn't contain acid, and it doesn't contain optical brighteners, and it doesn't contain lignin, and I used expensive inks. So what does all this mean? So when you buy cheap inkjet paper, the manufacturers use acid in order to make the paper look whiter, which is great. And the colors look really vibrant and wonderful when you print them. But over time, that color will definitely fade, and the acid will definitely have an effect on the paper. And the same goes with optical brighteners. This is the same stuff that goes into Persil or Daz or whatever wash. I don't. You probably do you get those? I don't know. But washing machine powder. They started putting optical brighteners in because it made white shirts really dazzlingly white. But it's not permanent, and it will fade. And all of these things are used in cheap papers because it makes them look fantastic briefly. Lignin is a really interesting one, and lignin is what causes this effect, this horrible sort of bronzing, I suppose you'd call it, of ancient newsprint. And lignin is a natural part of cellulose, part of the plant that's used to create paper. And again, cheap photographic paper will contain it. So in other words, when you pull a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old inkjet print that's been made on cheap paper out, 20 years on, it may well have started to go this horrid color. So if it's possible to avoid all of that, and I fully understand that the expensive papers are like 4 times the price of the cheap ones, but I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. I love my family photographs. I love the fact that, you know, my mother has pictures of the family, and, you know, after 10 years, they still look as bright and lovely as they did the day that they went into their frames. I haven't mentioned inks yet, but sadly, the same applies. I'm sure you all know that inkjet printers are the cost of inkjet printers are hugely subsidized by the manufacturer making them. They're incredibly cheap. And the reason that they're incredibly cheap is that inks are not. And Epson, for example, charge a small fortune for their ink sets, as I'm sure you all know from bitter experience. I've got a 10 cartridge A2 printer just behind me. And that was provided empty. And the first time that I filled it with inks, the cartridge's total cost was just over £800. Which is a staggering amount of money. However, that's more than a year's worth of ink. So, you know, as a professional, it paid for itself eventually. But yeah, use cheap inks, expect them to fade. Use brand name inks, pay the extra money, and they simply won't. So I love this. This is an image, a file that was sent to me by a member of Suffolk Mac user group. And the image on the right, so this was supposed to be an image that was taken on a stormy afternoon. And so one would have expected really warm colors and a deep gray sky. But the image on the right was a print that was provided by a member of his camera club, who said that he printed it on a printer not dissimilar to mine, a Canon 10 inked professional grade printer, which clearly wasn't color managing at all, because the one on the left is my print from exactly the same file. And well, you can see what an absolutely gigantic difference there is. I really don't know what the guy on the right was doing, but lesson learned. So how are we doing for time? Oh, that's all right. So we need to talk about color spaces and gamut. So your monitor has a gamut, and that gamut is basically a description of all of the colors that your monitor is capable of showing. And the same applies with your printer. And when we talk about printers with small gamut or low gamut, we might be talking in this little analogy, a printer with a low gamut would compare to this box of chalks, where the colors aren't very bright and they're not very strong and there aren't very many of them. A printer with a really wide gamut has got really bright, vibrant colors and lots of them. So in other words, the more crayons that you can squeeze into your printer effectively, the larger the gamut, so the better quality color you'll be able to produce from that printer. So if you spent 20 quid for your printer and it's got perhaps 3 cartridges in it, then the analogy is this one. This is what you're going to get. You're going to get not very strong colors, not very vibrant colors. It has very narrow gamut. So I guess the rule is with a printer, if you're buying a new one, just go for the one with the largest number of inks. As I said, the one sitting behind me has 10 cartridges in it and is capable of creating some really fantastic color. So we talked about this a few moments ago. So a gamut is basically a color space. They are both exactly the same thing. So let's just sort out the 2 definitions so that we know what we're talking about. There are 3 color spaces and they're device independent. Hopefully you'll have heard of all 3 of these. sRGB, Adobe RGB 1998, and ProPhoto RGB. So by the term device independent, it just means that wherever you use them, however you use them, whatever you use them on, they will always be exactly the same. An sRGB color space will be exactly the same, whether you're using a tiny, teeny compact camera or a wildly expensive pro grade DSLR. sRGB is sRGB. Adobe RGB 1998 is just a larger gamut. And ProPhoto RGB is a monstrously large gamut. So these days, if you're sending, I guess you guys must be in the same boat that we are. I'm hoping, Sheeta, you might be able to make a comment here, but I'm guessing probably if you send any images to a lab to have prints made, that they will expect you to use an sRGB profile.
That is correct, because it is the lower one, and most devices right now and everyone is sort of going for the common sRGB.
Yes.
It's usually photographers and professionals who know about the Adobe RGB and the Pro Photo. I'm glad to see that it's been more incorporated, because
Yeah.
that is awesome, just awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. So this is really, really important, because as Sheeta just said, everybody kind of talks about sRGB. However, your MacBook Pros now, your iPad Pros, your iPads, probably even your phone, I think, uses a new color space called P3, which is a video color space. I'm so sorry, this is so complex, but hopefully it gets ironed out in the end. So the color space that your MacBook Pros, your MacBooks, your anything with a Retina display basically is capable of displaying is actually much bigger than the sRGB color space. So if you use a camera that has that offers you the ability to select a color space, whether it be sRGB or Adobe RGB 1998, my recommendation is actually to choose Adobe RGB 1998, because it's a bigger color space. It's a little bit bigger than P3, but it means that it will exploit every single pixel's values of your wonderfully expensive and beautiful Apple Macintosh hardware. And it's my printer, for example, is I'm sitting in front of an Adobe RGB 1998 monitor, which was very expensive, but my printer is capable of printing Adobe RGB 1998. So in other words, if I use the sRGB color space and I sent images to my printer, I wouldn't be exploiting all of the wonderful colors that the printer is capable of pushing out. So we've kind of talked about that. So gamuts then are device dependent. So all of your equipment has a gamut, but a gamut is a color space. It's just one that is device dependent. So the gamut for my Canon camera may not necessarily be the same as the gamut for your Canon camera. The gamut for my Epson printer is probably different from the gamut for your Epson printer. And this is where the problem comes when it comes to, oh, I'm so sorry, I've just pressed the wrong button. Let's just get rid of that. We're back in the room. So this is how the process works. Expensive software, expensive hardware, but fairly easy software to use. So you can see that sheet of color that's on the monitor. That's a reproduction of a file that would be sent out to anybody that wants to have their printer calibrated. Usually there are 3 copies of them. And each one of those sheets goes into this device. And this is exactly the same process. It takes a great deal more time, but it's exactly the same process as the process for correcting the colors on your monitor. So we've got 3 sheets of paper, many hundreds of colors, which are now being sampled, and exactly the same process takes place. The colorimeter records the color of the sheet of color of swatches that you've supplied. The software then compares that color to the color that it knows that it should be, and it produces a lookup table. No surprise. Please bear with me while I rattle through these 3. I'm going to run out of talking. This is very, very time consuming. And
What is that machine called?
it's called a photospectrometer. X-Rite seem to be the market leaders for these devices, certainly in the UK. There are one or two others around, and they will all do an equally good job, I'm sure. I favor X-Rite, certainly for the colorimeter. I favor X-Rite because I know that their software is available freely. So in other words, you can use the device with as many pieces of equipment as you wish. So it makes that $160, you know, well worth it.
Mike, do you want to take a question from Dale?
Yeah, of course.
Dale, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, can you use the color correction on a nice TV, like an OLED TV? So that when you do a slideshow on your TV, it looks the same?
Yes, because obviously you have to be using your Mac, but yes, it works equally well. Yes, it's profoundly useful, incidentally, with a colorimeter. And I have I only use one monitor, but I have a number of friends who work with two monitors, and it's really infuriating if the two monitors don't precisely match each other, because obviously you've no idea which is right and which is wrong. So the only solution with that is to run a colorimeter. So the process is finished. Again, we're going to set the target brightness D65 aluminum, which means daylight, because photographs generally, certainly for me, are viewed in daylight. There are a number of other odd settings that need to be set. We'll give it a name. And then the Mac takes over and produces the lookup table.
Mike,
So this, yes.
if you have two monitors, what do you do? I have a computer and an external monitor connected to it. So we'll do
so you just calibrate each one separately.
Okay.
I'm assured that works.
Okay.
So what you so this is how you use it in real time. So I've got an image open in Photoshop here, and where it says color handling, I'm now going to switch it to Photoshop Manager's color, and I'm going to find the printer profile, Suffolk Mug 2020, that one, and now when I hit the print button, my printer will use the lookup table. My printer will use the lookup table and make all of those little incremental changes for each of the colors, and it will produce the best colors that it possibly can. Okay. I'd like to just, how much time have we got?
It's not quite 12:30.
Okay.
So you have about 15 minutes.
I'm probably not going to get on to talking about rendering intent, because I think we'll just stop the share for a moment. And nothing happens. Haha. That's good. I'm just going to open up this is a really geeky piece of software, but I hope makes it very clear. Share screen, desktop. Okay, so this is a piece of software called ColorThink, which I hope you're seeing at the moment.
Yes, we see it.
Great, great. And what's going on here is that I've imported an sRGB color space, and I've imported an Adobe RGB 1998 color space. Let's just see if I can slow that down a little bit. So if I just turn off the big one for a moment. So this is a diagrammatical representation of all of the colors that exist within the sRGB color space, okay? If I turn the Adobe RGB one back on, what's striking about Adobe RGB 1998 is the green end. So if you're a landscape photographer and your pictures include quite a lot of green, you can see that there's an absolute ton of green information. Not so important for me in theatre, but this is, the yellows are, the oranges and reds are, the blues are, and in all cases, it's a bigger space. Let's just have a look at it sideways on. So you can see these great big wedges of color that are available in the larger color space. So I am a Canon man and have always been, but I know that Canon offer the choice of either sRGB or Adobe RGB if you're shooting JPEGs. I mean, if you're shooting RAW, of course, you can make these decisions later, and it's not quite so important. Now, let me just pause that for a moment. I hadn't expected to get this far in, so I'm just going to do a bit of twiddling, if I may. I'm just going to add the gamut of my printer. Okay, this gets really awkward to see, so okay. So this is really interesting, isn't it? So what's happening here is, let's just reduce the opacity. So the big solid blob is the gamut of my printer, and is that right? No, it isn't. Sorry, I think my my Mac is having a meltdown at the moment. Been pushing too many apps at it. Hopefully this will correct itself. Otherwise, I may have to just close it and start again. Right. Let's try that again. So this is the sRGB color space. And now over that, we'll overlay the gamut for whatever paper it was that I did this test with. So you can see it's really interesting that there are bits of the color space that are not included. My printer's not very good at punching out to these really, really, really vibrant magentas. However, you can see where the wedge is for the yellow, but my printer can extend way out here with its yellows and oranges and reds. And that is why I always use Adobe RGB 1998 when I'm printing. And that is why my prints look astoundingly bright and kind of meet my clients' requirements, because obviously the theatre, and especially at Christmas, wants lots of colour front of house. I'm going to come to a halt there, if I may, and just take questions for the last 10 minutes or so, and then continue this at our next jaunt.
Okay. We do have a question from Jim Corsica. Jim,
I hope some of that's made sense.
It does, at least to me. Okay. Jim, could you ask your question?
Yes, Michael, as a math teacher, calculus teacher, I'm really enjoying your 3D spaces there. It's quite energizing. My question has to do with my external monitor.
Yes.
When I open up system preferences and I look at the display profiles under color, there's about 16 choices, 2 of which are ones that you listed, the Adobe 1998 one and the sRGB. How do I know which one is going to be the best to me? Do I just pick each one and see how it looks? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I mean, if you use a colorimeter, obviously you can use unique names then. So if you have access to a colorimeter, that would be the best solution, because then you can make absolutely certain that you're using the right one.
Otherwise, it's just eyeball it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you spend a lot of money on your external monitor?
No, I think it was a $200 Samsung.
So it's probably sRGB, because certainly here, a full Adobe RGB 1998 monitor would likely cost £300 plus.
Okay.
So, don't know, maybe not. And the only way to really know would be to run use a colorimeter.
Okay.
As a matter of interest, around Florida, indeed around the States, is there a company around like our Color Confidence where you would go for this sort of material, where you can get proper? One of the things I love about Color Confidence is that they have technicians on site who really understand color. They understand color science much better than I do. I mean, I have, bare bones understanding, but my bare bones understanding is enough for me to get the best colors I can. But it's fabulous having a company that you can pick up the phone to and they'll just help.
Does anybody know the answer to that question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Conrad,
Yeah.
yes.
There are several sources here locally. Bob Kennedy, I don't think does commercial work, but Frank Berna does. And 3 years ago, he calibrated my iMac Pro with the X-Rite equipment and did a nice job. And I tend to think that LEDs are very stable. I don't think that they're necessary for monthly calibration. That's just my opinion.
That may depend on the age of the equipment, I think. So it's very stable when it's new, but give it a few years down the line and then it may be perhaps not so.
Okay, I gotcha. And then there's a local company that I've not used, but I've been tempted to, called High Tech. And some people here may know about that company. So we do have resources here in Naples. And I just want to say that your talk was absolutely outstanding from my perspective. And I hope others feel the same way.
Thank you. You're very kind. It's been a nightmare, actually. in truth, around the period around the year 2000 when nobody knew anything, none of us knew anything. And we were all clutching at straws, and all of our professional labs were saying, you know, we're not interested. We're not doing your color correction. That's your problem. You go and sort it out. And of course, we all held our hands up and said, but how? And it took a few years to, you know, to sort it out. But this is really interesting. So if there's a guy in Naples who is offering that service, if anybody is interested, particularly, you know, if you're running a printer with a lot of ink cartridges in it, I'd really recommend having a profile made for it, because it's so cheap, you know, typically £15 here. And obviously they're paper and ink specific. So if you use 6 different types of paper, you'd need 6 different profiles, but most of us don't. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I only used 2. So worth thinking about,
Frank, do you have a question?
Yes, very, very good presentation. I really loved it. I got a lot out of it. I'm wondering, because I was motivated, I went to the site and looked it up, and there's 2 versions of ColorThink. One is ColorThink, one is ColorThink Pro, and ColorThink Pro is like $400 and ColorThink is $79. So what's the difference?
I absolutely know that ColorThink are working on a new 64-bit version. So now it's even if you are thinking of buying the less expensive version, I would hold fire for a few months, because I think there'll be a new one out anytime now.
Okay.
And it hasn't.
Would it give me the same accuracy, the same simple software, the same method of creating LUTs?
You're not creating, no, ColorThink is only designed to give you an illustration of what you've created using the X-Write software.
Right, right.
So the bits, if you want to calibrate your system, then the bits you need to be looking at are probably an i1, I think it's called i1 Studio, is definitely get the least expensive X-Write device, because it's perfectly adequate, absolutely perfectly adequate. The more expensive models have bells and whistles that none of us will ever use. That will set you back about $160. But if you want your printer profiled, I would definitely speak to the gentleman who said he has a friend in Naples who offers the service.
Oh,
Unread.
Okay.
Unread.
Yeah,
I have.
Frank Berna, he's multi-talented, and I recommend him. BERNA, he's on the web.
So
Yeah,
what would
he's actually used to be a member of the club, and and he comes and speaks to us every couple of years. Used to be the manager of the Ritz Camera Shop years ago.
Mike, I have a question.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Hi, I have a question about the calibration that's built into the Mac. Can you say anything about that for those who may not want to go this far? Is it worth going through Apple's calibration software?
No.
Okay.
It's hopelessly complex. And
Yes.
And also, when you go to the opticians and they start flashing things in front of you and they say, okay, now which version of this is more in focus? And you look at them and you think, I don't know. I mean, I've done that any number of times. And that's what happens with the color calibration that's built in. You look at things and just think, I have no idea. I have no idea which is the better of these options. So
I thought that was me. So everybody else has had that experience, because I mean, it was just a horrible experience.
Sorry, we're talking about the opticians now.
Yeah, I'm talking about trying to calibrate your Mac with its
Oh
with
yes,
its own
no,
software.
it's hopeless, absolutely hopeless. I wouldn't mind betting that if you try and use it, you'll probably end up with something that's not as good as it is at the moment. It's all to do with color latency and stuff. And if you're relying on your eyes making those choices rather than a piece of hardware, I think you're on a loser because of color latency and stuff. You know, somebody once told me when you first use, if you're in this situation with a really bright monitor, and you set it up correctly, and it drops, for example, from 300, a value of 300 brightness levels down to the 90 or 100 that's recommended, it looks like you switched it off. And you just look at it and think, oh, this can't be right. And so the person who illustrated it to me the first time actually said, when you actually install the profile, when you press the done button, you close your eyes so that you're not even aware that that change has taken place. And so that when you then open your eyes, it's not quite such a big shock.
Okay.
I don't know whether there's any use in that or not.
Yeah, one last question, because someone mentioned, you mentioned about the amount of time, not amount of time, but the frequency in which you calibrate your monitor, which is like once a month. I actually have heard of professionals who do it more frequently because they say it depends on the equipment. It depends on how long the equipment has been on when you do the calibration. And there are so many moving variables that they do calibrate their monitor frequently. Okay. Okay. All right, you have 1 minute.
Gosh, well, thanks for listening, everybody, and I hope nobody's fallen asleep.
No, this was a great, outstanding meeting, and I'm pleasantly surprised that we had as many people here, because I was concerned that we were going to really limit the amount of people's interest. But and I remember when I tried to calibrate using the Apple software, I immediately set up an appointment with my ophthalmologist because I thought there was a dramatic problem I had with my eyes. So I feel much better now.
All right. Well, everyone, can you open up your mics and thank Mike?
Thank you.